And now we have to say welcome to Irene van Kamp, coming all the way from the Netherlands.
Yeah, wow.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Irene, for traveling here. You are very used to Sweden. You have been a guest professor in Gothenburg. Irene is, I think, known to everybody here. She had been involved in so many large European studies, not least in those studies around Schiphol, the airport in Netherlands, where so many papers came out, and we have so much knowledge from that. And today you are going to focus more on the child. You have also looked at different periods of life where we are vulnerable for noise. And I also want to tell you, she's just a great person to be around. The floor is yours.
Not
Irene.
today. Yeah, this is not really about our own studies, but an overview. It's quite ambitious, I must admit, of what we know about early childhood effects of noise and the long-term effects it has on health. I thought I had 30 minutes, so someone has to warn me that it's enough. So yeah, and I prepared this in an earlier stage for a workshop together with Shesten Persson-Way from Gothenburg University, who will speak later. So to start with, I want to tell you something about why is noise really a problem. I mean, I know you all are convinced, but there are many people who are not that impressed with noise issues. And why would we need a life course approach to this? I'll talk a bit about noise and health in vulnerable groups, and then go on give you an overview of what do we know. Well, I heard a lot of new things today already. So the prenatal stuff and the language acquisition, I will not dwell on that. It's really focused on health and well-being. And then I will give a little idea of where we think are the main mechanisms and how we should continue with this work. So now this is from the New Scientist when WHO was publishing a WHO burden of disease, and this was actually sort of leaked into the press. That's fantastic. So it was earlier in the New Scientist than in the report itself. And I think it gives a very beautiful overview of what we know. And it was from 2007, but it's still in the realm of what we would state today. Daytime traffic leads to cardiovascular effects. It leads to sleep disturbance, annoyance, tinnitus, cognitive effects. Well, they actually speak of slower learning in children, which is a sort of funny term, but it means the same. And finally, hearing issues from leisure or recreational noise. And you see the numbers on the right side at the number of people at risk and the years of life in health lost due to noise. I think these kinds of pictures are very important to use to convince the policymakers, the people who are not in the field. So what do we know? Well, this is a list of the effects that have been studied, not necessarily only in children, actually more in adults than children. Annoyance is a big issue, I guess, because it's a policy issue. It gives you an anchor point. It's scientifically a rather difficult concept, annoyance. Sleep disturbance, both objective, subjective, cognitive impairment, cardiovascular risk, physiological reactions, mental health. And the last bit is not that they're less important, but they're very little studied. So birth weight, immune system effects, biochemical effects, and hearing loss. And yeah, we definitely think that all these effects should in future research account for life course, life phase, and susceptible groups. Now, usually when you talk about susceptible groups, it's children, older people, and people with some disease or impairment. But children are, of course, not necessarily more vulnerable. They can learn quicker. They're more protected, but they do hear better. So, as we heard already, even in the womb, they do learn and hear. This is an overview of the rationale behind all this study. The key question is, are we really dealing with a vulnerable group? It's mentioned in most reviews. It's a sort of obligatory paragraph in all the calls at the EU level, but actually there's a very limited number of studies that are specifically aimed at vulnerability. Most studies are very small scaled. We do know a lot about air traffic noise, but not all the other sources that are much more common in our living environment. Children are most vulnerable, but I'm beginning to doubt if that's the only thing, but to noise specifically in their cognitive development. And that's not necessarily because they're vulnerable, because they're in a very crucial stage in their development. And as we see, we studied children 9 to 11, but the age is getting earlier and earlier because it really happens much earlier. Language acquisition happens much earlier. All the learning happens much earlier, as we saw before in some of the talks. So, therefore, effects at a cognitive level, for instance, a disturbed sleep in children. Children sleep better than adults or older people, but the effects are there even if they keep sleeping and do not awake. So the effects might actually be larger, and as Mette mentioned, it might be sort of predictor of hyperactive behavior or a mechanism working there. Also, children are vulnerable because they didn't learn how to cope. They don't know how to distinguish between a hum and a sentence that doesn't make sense. They still need all the attention to learn that. Also children, and that has been shown, who grow up in very noisy environments tend to sort of give up, like, okay, I will not pay attention, which is referred to as learned helplessness, and it really affects other parts of life as well. So it might be a sort of general attitude they learn, like, okay, I will not pay attention, who cares? And that affects their learning a lot. And also, we think that we should define places where children come off, preschool, schools, other venues, to consider those as vulnerable places. Because children don't spend all their time at home. They go through all these different environments, and we should actually create environments in a broader sense, which are enhancing learning and well-being and health. These are tables which were published by WHO and other health institute. Dutch Health Council used to renew them every once in a while, and it just gives you an overview. There's sufficient evidence for effects of, and this is particular for children, effects on annoyance at school, outdoors, sufficient effect for cognitive reading, memory, auditive discrimination, and speech intelligibility. All of that has been studied primarily in school situations. There's limited evidence for motivation and hearing loss due to recreational noise. And if we go further, these are all very rarely studied in children. We have a little bit of evidence, but it's based on 1 or 2 studies per topic. And effects of noise on sleep in children is inconclusive. Some studies find an effect, others don't find an effect. So there's still a lot of work to do there. So now, why do we want to squeeze this whole item in a much more complex model of life course? It's hard enough to study children at one stage in their life. Why do we want to make it so complicated? because there's so many factors involved in it, and the impact of these factors in one phase affects the effect in other phases. So it's a sequential sort of cumulation of goods or bads. And a healthy living environment in those terms of physical environment is one of these clusters of factors. You can subdivide life course in different life phases based on age or developmental stages. And we could state in general, in some stages, people are more vulnerable to environmental issues and health effects than in others. But it's also possible that these effects in sensitive periods are co-affected by factors during later phases. In that case, we talk about a domino effect. It just starts falling one after the other. We should distinguish, I already said that, sensitive periods and sensitive locations, and the living environment, including noise. That's a key message, can negatively but also positively affect health. And we tend in noise land to move from all the negatives to what are the needs, what are the requirements of a good environmental noise quality. And especially the soundscape approach, which you might have heard of, is more in that positive realm. And I think even if it's just a way to sell the story better, it's something we should consider, like phrase it in a positive way. So it's about, because up till now we do only look at effects at the moment. Well, different after the cohort studies and long-term effects, but usually we measure the noise now and we look at the effects now. But we need to look at exposures in the past and effects in the future. You couldn't do that in retrospect if you have a cohort which was a birth cohort starting at one point in time and now people are adults, but usually you don't have the exposure levels properly, but it can be done. And you should look at the specific groups that are of interest. Now, I'll take you through time quickly because my time is limited, of course. Jenny already spoke about early effects of stress on the fetus. There's a few studies have been performed which showed effects indeed. At the moment, there's a WHO guideline update in preparation, and one part wasn't there the previous version, but Mark Nieuwenhuis has reviewed all the studies on low birth weight in relation to environmental noise. As we see in the studies available, there's very few available, the effects are either not existent or there's no evidence. There's some evidence for occupational noise and low birth weight, small for gestational, difficult word, age and preterm birth. And finally, Gehring in 2014 in Canada looked at a large sample of births, and he found a small effect using modeled traffic noise as exposure estimates. And I think that's very important as well, after adjustment for air pollution, because these two often go together when we are dealing with health effects, particular cardiovascular, also cognitive, but also in birth weight and preterm birth, etc. The hearing part I will skip because we already heard a lot about that. In summary, if we look at prenatal effects, there's clearly a need for more studies. We lack enough knowledge on critical periods. It's still too rough, too broad. Exposure assessment needs to be improved, including frequency characteristics. So we also need to include the low frequency aspect. And yeah, that's a bit idealistic, but we do need a holistic approach where we don't just look at the school or the home, but the whole bit. Home, work, sleep quality, noise at home, noise at work. So now I move a bit up in age. These children are actually smaller than the ones we studied in the Ranch study. These are findings for the Ranch study, and what you see is the curve of annoyance from the parents and the children. And in general, just looking at it, they score quite similar as the parents, whereas they start earlier with reporting annoyance. So this is based on questionnaires in school children, but at the higher end, the parents score higher, and that might be, we always say, that might be an effect. Children are not political, so they don't score on the annoyance scales as if they want to influence politicians. So the upper end is a bit overestimated in adults. That's how you could look at it. But still, we can measure annoyance in school children, and maybe Justin will dwell on it. We also looked at annoyance in children of 4 or 5 years old, and they indeed can tell you how annoyed they are. You have to adapt the phrasing, but I was amazed how well they can indicate how annoyed they are by noise and how well it relates to the exposure levels. Sleep, second very important factor. Why is this so important? I will dwell a bit more on sleep because I think it's a very important mechanism. Undisturbed sleep is essential for physiological and psychological health. Children have a special need for uninterrupted sleep for growth and cognitive development. There's a change everywhere in an economy which is always alive and more noise day and night. Sleep is generally seen as an intermediate effect. So a bad sleep in itself is a health outcome, but it leads to all these different effects. It can initiate disease or aggravate existing disease, including behavioral issues and mental issues, of course. And whether this happens, and this is all based on what we know, depends on noise sensitivities, people with somatic or mental disorders, shift workers and older workers. And in children we see in particular, and has been studied by Even Öström, among others, in Gothenburg in the past, that children respond much stronger physiologically to noise during their sleep than adults do, which is sort of counterintuitive of what people think. They do awake less, but the effects are much stronger. And you could imagine that has effects on cardiovascular system later on in life. We make a distinction between acute next day and long-term effects of sleep. And I think this is important to show. The estimates of the prevalence range from 5 to 30%, depends very much on how we define sleep disturbance. When you ask the GPs to register it, they find 5%, but if you ask the parents, they score much higher. So, yeah, somewhere in between there will be the truth. There is more harmonization needed, and in a Swedish national survey, which is quite strong evidence, I think. 1 out of 7 12-year-old children, that's 15%, indicated themselves that they were disturbed in their sleep by noise. And for about 25,000 school children in the age of 7 to 14, this occurred several times. So this is just by asking the children themselves, which is a good enough source besides the other estimates, I think. And these are quite remarkable numbers, I think. I talked a little bit about the long-term effects. There are cardiovascular effects. In the EU hyena study, which we were involved with, it was shown that due to noise, there was a non-dipping effect in the diastole blood pressure, which means during the sleep it didn't go down, which has a lot of effect on the restoration of physiological functions in particular. So that's quite a strong evidence of serious effects. Disturbed balance in the immune system has been found, and more lately obesity is related to lack of sleep. It has been found in shift workers, stewardesses, etc. And the risk related with this, the risk of diabetes in long term. So in conclusion, it's still not very completely clear how noise-related sleep disturbance affects children's health and learning, but there's a lot of hypotheses there. We made a review and wrote out a few years ago and actually phrased these hypotheses. There's a lot of work might be added to this since we're looking much more at the gene-environment interactions, and there's a lot of interesting work in Canada being done on that. And not least important, there's still enormous debate what noise indicators we should use to study sleep. There's not really consensus on that. Cardiovascular effects in children. How much time do I have left? 1 minute. Okay, then I really have to go fast. But I'll go. In the RUNCH study, we studied the effects of blood pressure around major airports, Heathrow and Schiphol, and indeed there was positive association, but large differences. Babish has done some study on road traffic noise in children and effects on blood pressure. And I think it's important to tell you that an elevated blood pressure in childhood actually is a very good predictor of later on hypertension in adult life and older life. I think can I show 3 or 4 more sheets? The cognitive effects actually have been documented best. They're based on the NORA study, which is very recently published by Maria Klatte, the children's study, really worthwhile reading. The RUNCH study, which was an EU project around 3 major airports, and based on the Munich and Tirol study, and very strong evidence that comprehensive reading is affected by aircraft noise. And that effect remains also if you follow the children over a few years, it remains in time, which Charlotte Clark has shown in her longitudinal study. In summary, children are more vulnerable to noise, especially with regards to cognitive development. We can talk about a vulnerable period in terms of development and learning, but also vulnerable places. And children are vulnerable because they didn't build up a proper coping mechanism yet. So the mechanisms we can assume is a disturbed sleep, learned helplessness. The other mechanisms might be related to restorative environments and quiet sites if children have access to a variety of noise environments. They might do better, and there's some work now at our place and in Sweden as well to study this. Now, I'll skip a lot. We are working in the framework of a network of people who work in the field of noise and health in children on an overall integrated model. It's a stress kind of model, but it does take aspects as restoration, susceptibility, and other environmental exposures. How much green area is there? Is there air pollution? What are the visual aspects of environments? So we're working on this model. And to make it even more complicated, we actually defined a model at a workshop last year where we distinguished all the phases, and we are big ambition is to fill these cells, like what are the specific exposures, what are the outcomes, and what are the policy implications or interventions possible here. And of course this looks very broad and ambitious, but if we could map this, we could see where the gaps really are in the noise and health in children field. And lastly, this is the visual presentation we made at the workshop we had. And believe me, it's a very complicated topic we are dealing with, but worthwhile. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene van Kamp, for this broad meta overview over European sound environmental work. Really incredible. We need this so much in Sweden to have a perspective like yours. We have two short questions before lunch. There's probably a lot of questions to ask to Irene van Kamp, because she has the answer to many, many questions.
Oops.
Is there anybody who want to have a question right now, or you feel like, okay, everybody's stunned, and we will come back in the afternoon when we have a discussion.
Thank you.
Right, thank you.
Thank you.